The train platform was crowded that Tuesday morning when Vincent the Viper Castellano made the worst mistake of his life. Nobody saw it coming. Not the commuters rushing to catch the 9:15 to Boston. Not the newspaper vendor who'd been working that corner for 20 years. And certainly not Vincent himself, who stood there in his expensive Italian suit, surrounded by 4 of his best men, laughing as he hurled that word across the platform. The word that stopped Bumpy Johnson in his tracks. The racial slur echoed off the marble walls of Grand Central Terminal. Travelers froze. Whispers spread like wildfire. Because everyone in Harlem knew one thing about Bumpy Johnson. You could threaten his business, you could challenge his territory, but you never, ever disrespected the man himself. Bumpy turned slowly, his eyes locked onto Vincent's, and he smiled. That smile terrified Vincent's crew more than any threat could have, because men who knew Bumpy understood that smile. It wasn't anger, it wasn't rage, it was calculation. It was a promise written in blood that hadn't been spilled yet. "You got something to say to me?" Bumpy's voice was calm, almost conversational. Vincent laughed, emboldened by his numbers advantage. "Yeah, I got plenty to say. This is our city now. You people need to remember your place." The platform went silent. Even the train announcements seemed to pause. Bumpy nodded once, twice. Then he adjusted his hat, straightened his coat, and walked away, without another word. Vincent's men cheered. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd just humiliated the most powerful black gangster in New York. They had no ideas. They'd just started a 72-hour countdown to hell. But here's what nobody knew that morning. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just any gangster. He wasn't some street-level hustler who'd fight with his fists and move on. No, Bumpy had spent 15 years building something unprecedented, a network so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in both the criminal underworld and legitimate business, that he could destroy a man without ever pulling a trigger. And Vincent Castellano had just insulted him in front of hundreds of witnesses. The first call Bumpy made was to a man named Theodore. Not a gangster, not a muscle. Theodore was an accountant for 3 Italian-owned casinos in New Jersey. He was also on Bumpy's payroll and had been for 6 years. "Theodore," Bumpy said into the phone, his voice still eerily calm. "Remember those books I asked you to keep? The real ones?" "Yes, Mr. Johnson." "I need copies, all of them, by tonight." The second call was to Judge Harrison, who owed Bumpy a favor from 1935, the kind of favor that involved Bumpy making a witness disappear before a corruption trial. The third call was to Madame Francine, who ran the most exclusive brothel in Manhattan, the one where Vincent's boss, Don Angelo Genovese, spent every Thursday night with his mistress. But wait, this gets even more calculated. See, Bumpy didn't just want revenge. He wanted to send a message that would echo through every mob family from New York to Chicago. He wanted the Italians to understand that their casual racism, their assumption that they could disrespect him without consequences, was about to cost them everything. Hour 6, Theodore delivered 9 ledgers showing systematic tax evasion, money laundering, and federal violations across Don Angelo's entire operation, numbers that could put the Don away for life. Hour 12, Judge Harrison quietly filed papers for federal warrants, but he didn't execute them. Not yet. That would be too simple. Hour 18, Madame Francine made a phone call to Mrs. Genovese, a phone call that included details about Don Angelo's Thursday night activities, details about the brownstone on 52nd Street, details about the 23-year-old blonde from Boston, and then Bumpy waited. He didn't hide. He didn't flee. He went about his business, visiting his policy banks, checking on his numbers runners, having dinner at Red Rooster with his wife. He was visible, available, almost daring Vincent to make a move. Vincent didn't, because by hour 24, word had reached him that something was wrong. His collections were being refused. His enforcers were being turned away. Street-level operators who'd always paid their tribute were suddenly unavailable. The Harlem network had closed ranks. Hour 30, Vincent tried to meet with Don Angelo. The Don wasn't available. He tried again, still unavailable. A third time. The Don's consigliere delivered a message. The Don is dealing with a family emergency. That family emergency was Mrs. Genovese filing for divorce and threatening to testify about everything she knew unless she received a very generous settlement. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. Hour 42. Federal agents raided 3 of Don Angelo's warehouses, not because of Theodore's ledgers, those were still being held in reserve. No, this raid happened because someone had tipped them off about a shipment of untaxed liquor coming from Canada. That someone was a dock worker Bumpy had helped get hired 3 years ago. Hour 48. Vincent's own crew started looking at him differently, because word on the street was that Vincent's insult had brought heat on the entire organization. Federal heat, divorce heat, the kind of heat that made soldiers nervous and bosses angry. Hour 54. Don Angelo requested a meeting with Bumpy Johnson, not through intermediaries, not through channels. The Don himself made the call, his voice carefully controlled but clearly strained. "We need to talk about Vincent," the Don said. "I'm listening," Bumpy replied. "He acted without thinking, without permission. He disrespected you, and in doing so, he disrespected our understanding, our mutual respect." Bumpy let the silence stretch, let the Don feel the weight of what was happening. "Your wife seems upset," Bumpy said casually. The Don exhaled slowly. "Yes, that situation is complicated. Federal agents seem interested in your warehouses. Also complicated. And I hear your ledgers might have some inconsistencies." The Don knew. He knew exactly what Bumpy had done. In 72 hours, Bumpy Johnson had systematically dismantled Don Angelo's personal life, threatened his business empire, and positioned himself to destroy everything the Italian mob had built, all without firing a single shot. "What do you want?" Don Angelo asked finally. "Vincent. Done. What else?" "I want every family from here to Philadelphia to know what happens when someone disrespects Bumpy Johnson. I want it understood that my territory is untouchable. My people are untouchable. And I am untouchable. Consider it done." Hour 67. Vincent Castellano was found in an alley in Little Italy. He wasn't dead. Bumpy didn't want him dead. That would be too quick, too simple. No, Vincent was alive, but he'd been worked over by his own crew. Broken ribs, shattered knee, facial injuries that would leave permanent scars. But more than that, he'd been stripped of his status, his position, his protection. The mob had cut him loose, marked him as an outcast. In their world, that was a death sentence delivered in slow motion. A note was pinned to his coat, courtesy of Harlem, with respect. Hour 72. Bumpy Johnson walked back into Grand Central Terminal. He stood on the same platform where Vincent had insulted him. The same newspaper vendor was there. The same commuters rushing to catch trains. But this time every mobster, every criminal, every person connected to the underworld in that terminal knew exactly who Bumpy Johnson was. And they knew what he'd just done. He'd taken on the Italian Mafia, not with violence, not with war, but with pure strategic genius. He'd used their own systems against them. He'd exploited their weaknesses, their contradictions, their assumption that they were untouchable. Don Angelo himself sent an emissary to that platform, a public gesture. The emissary approached Bumpy, removed his hat, and bowed slightly. The Don sends his respects. He wishes to formalize the understanding between your territories and ours. Equal partners, equal respect. Bumpy adjusted his own hat, that same smile playing at his lips. Tell the Don I accept his respect, and tell him that in Harlem, we don't just remember insults. We teach lessons about them. But wait, you need to hear what happened next, because this is where the story becomes legendary. The news spread through the criminal underworld, like electricity through water. From New York to Chicago to Kansas City to Los Angeles, every mobster, every gangster, every criminal operator heard the story of how Bumpy Johnson had brought the Mafia to its knees in 72 hours without firing a shot. Frank Costello, one of the most powerful mob bosses in America, requested a meeting with Bumpy the following week, not to threaten, not to negotiate territory, but to ask a simple question: how did you do it? Bumpy leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, and smiled that smile again. You want to know the secret, you Italians, you Russians, you Irish? You all think power comes from violence, from fear, from being the toughest guy in the room. He paused, letting smoke curl toward the ceiling. But real power comes from knowing things, from being patient, from understanding that every man has something he values more than his pride. For Don Angelo, it was his marriage, his freedom, his empire. I didn't threaten any of those things. I just reminded him that they could disappear. Costello studied him for a long moment. You could have killed Vincent. Killing Vincent would have started a war. Wars are expensive, messy. They hurt business on all sides. Bumpy tapped ash into a tray. What I did instead, I made Vincent an example. I showed every racist, every bigot, every fool who thinks he can disrespect me that there are consequences worse than death. And what consequences are those? Living with everyone knowing you're the man who broke the Mafia. Living with your own people hating you for bringing disaster down on them. Living with the knowledge that one black man from Harlem outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and outthought an entire organization. But here's the part that shocked even Bumpy's closest allies. 3 weeks after the Grand Central incident, Theodore the accountant showed up at Bumpy's office with a briefcase full of cash, $50,000. What's this? Bumpy asked. Don Angelo sent it. He said it's a consultation fee. He wants to know if you'd be willing to provide certain services in the future. Bumpy laughed. Actually laughed. They want to hire me. Apparently your methods impress them. They're asking if you'd be willing to handle certain delicate situations that require your particular expertise. And that's when Bumpy Johnson became something unprecedented in American criminal history. He became the first black gangster that the Italian Mafia not only respected, but actively sought out as an equal partner and strategic consultant. The epilogue to this story is even more remarkable. For the next 15 years until his death in 1968, Bumpy Johnson operated with a level of immunity and respect that no other black gangster had ever achieved. The Italians never moved against him. The Irish stayed out of Harlem. The police, while they arrested him occasionally, understood that Bumpy maintained a certain order in his territory. He became known as the Godfather of Harlem. But that title doesn't capture what he really was. He was a strategic mastermind who understood that in a racist society, a black man's greatest weapon wasn't violence. It was intelligence, patience, and the ability to turn an enemy's prejudice into their own blindness. Vincent Castellano lived another 12 years. He worked as a low-level numbers runner in New Jersey, never regaining his status, never returning to New York. Every time someone asked him what happened, he'd touch his scarred face and say the same thing: "I disrespected the wrong man." As for that moment at Grand Central Terminal, it became legend. Young gangsters, black and white alike, would hear the story as a lesson. Some saw it as a tale of revenge, others as a story of strategic brilliance. But Bumpy Johnson himself told it differently when asked years later by a young Frank Lucas, who would later become infamous in his own right. "You want to know what that moment taught me, Frank? It taught me that racism is a weakness. When men underestimate you because of your skin color, they're giving you an advantage. They're showing you exactly where they're vulnerable." Vincent thought being Italian made him superior. That assumption, that prejudice, that racism, it's what killed his career. He paused, his eyes distant, remembering. "I didn't beat Vincent Castellano because I was tougher. I beat him because I was smarter, and I was smarter because I had to be. Every black man in America has to be twice as good to get half as far. But that struggle, that constant need to be smarter, more strategic, more patient, it made me into something they never expected. It made me into their nightmare." And 72 hours after a racist insult at Grand Central Terminal, the entire criminal underworld learned a lesson that would echo for generations. Never underestimate Bumpy Johnson, never disrespect Harlem, and never ever assume that power comes from the color of your skin rather than the strength of your mind. The train platform returned to normal that week. Commuters rushed to catch their trains. The newspaper vendor sold his papers. And somewhere in Little Italy, a broken man named Vincent Castellano learned to live with the consequences of 15 seconds of bigotry that cost him everything. But in Harlem, in the smoky back rooms of policy banks and numbers operations, in the elegant townhouses where power brokers met in secret, they still tell the story. They still remember the day Bumpy Johnson proved that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a gun. It's a brilliant mind attached to a man who refuses to accept disrespect. And that's a weapon that can't be beaten, bought, or broken, no matter how many men you bring to the fight. The legacy of that 72-hour period still resonates today. It changed how organized crime operated in New York. It established protocols of respect across racial lines that hadn't existed before, and it created the blueprint for how Bumpy Johnson would dominate Harlem for the next 3 decades. But most importantly, it proved something that racist men like Vincent Castellano couldn't comprehend, that genius, strategy, and power have no color, and the man who forgets that lesson pays for it with everything he has.